Let's talk about the Sega Genesis, known as the Sega Mega Drive in Europe and Japan. It's by far Sega's most financially successful console. Although successful, its life cycle was turbulent and controversial. We've all heard the term console wars, but this phrase actually first originated from the heavily contested video game market of the early 1990s. A battle between the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. First released in Japan in 1988, 1989 in North America, and 1990 in Europe, the console was not an immediate success. In fact, it failed to make significant grounds in the Japanese market. Sega's launch in Japan was scuppered by the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES, a game that would sell up to 18 million units and is still regarded as one of the best video games of all time. Sometimes, timing is everything. The launch in America and Europe only fared slightly better. A strong library of launch titles such as Space Harrier 2, Altered Beast in North America, Columns, Alex Kidd, and Golden Axe in Europe, amongst others, still failed to make a significant impact in these regions. When we think of the Sega Genesis, we think of the fierce competition between the Super Nintendo. Ironically, the Sega Genesis was actually intended to compete with the NES and the PC engine developed by NEC, known as the TurboGrafx-16 in other regions. At the time of development, Sega concluded that the best way to compete against the NES and PC engine would be to release a 16-bit console, focusing on the limitations of the NES and superiority of the Genesis. During the launch of the Sega Genesis, Sega emphasized the potential power of the system with aggressive advertising and PR, most notably with the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." At the time, Sega also heavily focused on releasing games endorsed by celebrities in order to increase the popularity of the console. A number of titles were endorsed by celebrities, most of which were sports stars. The one notable exception and most famously endorsed Genesis game was Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. This direction was somewhat successful for the system, but still fell short against the NES. Sega would need to try something else in order to achieve its goal. To change the system's fortunes, Sega appointed Tom Kalinske as CEO of Sega of America. Tasked with making the Genesis a success in Western markets, Tom Kalinske proposed a few changes. Increase advertising expenditure and promotion, drop the price of the system in order to gain a competitive advantage against the upcoming SNES. At launch, the Genesis retailed for $189, compared to the SNES $199. Western game divisions were introduced in order to better develop games that catered to Western audiences. And finally, and arguably the most important change, to drop Altered Beast as the console's pack-in game and replace with the newly released Sonic the Hedgehog. 2 years since the console had been released, with modest success, now suddenly the popularity exploded. Sega now had a clear company mascot in Sonic the Hedgehog. The personality of the character, fast, cool and edgy, perfectly reflected Sega's own brand identity. The game garnered acclaim from reviewers and players, with many seeing it as an answer to Nintendo's Super Mario franchise. The game alone helped Sega move consoles at a ratio of 2-1 over the Super Nintendo during the 1991 holidays. Sega would release more Sonic games throughout the system's life, most of which were very successful, financially and critically. Sonic 2, in particular, received critical acclaim and replaced Sonic 1 as the default packing game for the system. This helped the game sell upwards of 6 million copies, making it the second best-selling game for the system, behind its predecessor. Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles pushed the Genesis even further in terms of graphical capability and audio quality, helping the system to stay competitive against the SNES. This was certainly Sega's golden years. However, it was inevitable that eventually the Super Nintendo would catch up. In so many ways, a superior system and a strong lineup of first-party games helped reduce the gap between the two consoles. Both Nintendo and Sega battled it out to produce the best games possible, focusing on what each respective console was best at doing. A major difference between the two companies was their respecting target markets and their stance on mature video games. The SNES was marketed towards everyone and therefore retained a family-friendly approach in order to remain broad and avoid controversy. Sega, on the other hand, mainly targeted young teenagers, building a reputation as the cool and edgy product. Both systems had violent video games, eventually, but Sega certainly took a more blasé approach. Nintendo of America inspected each game before release, with the intent of reducing or eliminating the amount of violence shown. We may see this as Nintendo being sticklers, but they wanted to ensure that games were as accessible as possible and avoid any controversy that could have damaged their image. The most prominent example of this was the release of the 1992 game, Mortal Kombat. The game was released on both platforms, but differed greatly. Although the SNES counterpart was technically closer to the arcade version than the Genesis, all graphic violence was removed. Most notably, blood was replaced with sweat, and the famous fatalities, in which the series is known for, were severely watered down. The Genesis version was also released in this watered down state, but chose to include a cheat code which, when entered, returned the game to its original form. As these things often do, word spread quickly and the cheat code became anything but secret. A simple workaround, but the decision helped the Genesis version sell 4 times the amount of the SNES version. Needless to say, the decision was a highly controversial one. This, along with other violent video games released, such as Night Trap for the Sega CD, forced the industry to develop a rating system which would be applied to all games. The result was the creation of the SERB, the rating system still used today. In the UK, this was mainly handled by the ELSPA from 1994, until it changed to the PEGI system from 2003. Due to the rating system becoming the industry standard, Nintendo's own censorship was now irrelevant, and they were free to release any game unaltered, with the ESRB now in effect. Despite this, the controversy surrounding it only helped reinforce Sega's brand identity and edgy persona. I guess the phrase, "there's no such thing as bad publicity," holds true in some circumstances. Mortal Kombat 2 released on both platforms as originally intended, with the SNES version again being technically superior. Even so, the Genesis version still sold better. Although not as a ratio of 4:1, like its predecessor, the controversy surrounding it seemed to have had the desired effect. If you want to play mature video games, play it on the Genesis. Towards the end of the system's life cycle, it became clear that the SNES was superior in many ways, better able to take advantage of more colours, better audio quality, and unique features such as Mode 7. Although the Genesis remained competitive, Sega were obviously concerned about the rise in quality of recent SNES games. Sega felt threatened by the superior SNES and felt this needed to be addressed in order to remain true to their original advertising slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not the case. Sega's marketing and advertising strategies at the time were unorthodox but very effective. Pinnacle of their marketing brilliance was surely their blast processing gimmick. We may laugh at this now, and the slogan became somewhat of a meme even in the 1990s, but at the time, it seemed that Sega could have sold wood to a lumberjack. It just so happens that the Sega Genesis had a faster processor than the SNES, the only variable that was technically superior to anything on the SNES. Sega decided to take full advantage of this and advertised the fact that the system was much quicker and therefore more capable than the SNES. It needed a catchy hook in order to sell it right, and the term blast processing was coined. This blast processing, as it was called, did provide the Genesis with some useful advantages, such as higher frame rates and better resolutions. Although Sega put this term to good use for a while, the numerous advantages of the SNES would remain a constant thorn in their side. In order for the Genesis to remain technically competitive, Sega and other third-party developers found ingenious ways to match what was capable on the SNES. Some developers took advantage of Sega's faster processor, and many developers took advantage of Nintendo's Mode 7, larger colour palette and sprites. This all resulted in some truly unique gaming experiences on both consoles, with both companies pushing to release the best games. It seems unfortunate then that Sega perhaps lacked confidence in their abilities to sell the Genesis under the assumption that it was technically superior. It wasn't, of course, but as we have just revealed, the Genesis still had a few hands left to play and was pumping out some great games, both first and third party. Sales of the console certainly confirmed this, but as Nintendo started to catch up and perhaps even overtake, Sega felt it necessary to create an add-on. The Sega CD was just that. The Sega CD was a powerful add-on. It had greater audio and graphical capability and was able to cater to games that would rival that of the SNES. It also had video capabilities, although a lot of games took this concept and really ran with it. Unfortunately, it was expensive and consumers were not all that interested. Maybe they would have been were it not for the price and the fact that you also needed a Genesis to play it. A hefty sum for anyone who doesn't already own a Genesis, and a lot to ask for the already established market. Third-party developers weren't too interested either. They would rather focus on the massive install base of the Genesis. Why risk developing a game for an add-on that isn't even proven yet? I guess you could call it Catch-22, but that was the position they were in. It seems that they didn't learn their lesson either, because in an attempt to cash in on the 32-bit hype, they developed another add-on, the 32X. This wasn't very popular. Sega then seemed very eager to jump into bed with the 32-bit, and focus their attention on the Sega Saturn. In doing so, they seriously neglected their position in the 16-bit market, which at the time was very strong. Tom Kalinske even supposed that they could have sold an extra 300,000 Genesis units during 1995. As Sega underestimated their 16-bit position, Nintendo were happy to pick up the pieces. The late release of Donkey Kong Country gave the SNES a second wind and sold upwards of 9 million units, providing Nintendo with the staying power to hold off the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn until the release of the Nintendo 64. In the end, whether you owned the SNES or Genesis, everyone was a winner. The quality of games on show was phenomenal, and both companies truly outdid themselves. Although Sega would never reach the same level of success with subsequent consoles, the Sega Genesis remains one of the few consoles that has etched its name in video game history, upsetting the order of the video game industry and leaving us with some truly memorable gaming experiences. Before I leave you, I'd just like to say a big thank you for checking out my video. A like and a subscribe would not go amiss. If you like my content and you'd like to see me create more, then I'd really appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. The more supporters I get, the more time I'll be able to dedicate to this channel. Every little helps. Thank you so much, and until next time, see you around.